you're going to have to crank your volumes up because my voice is still not back. I'm sorry about that. But let's define the moment. This doesn't look like Oh, wait. I know everybody wants to say that, and I've talked about it before. It doesn't look like 2020 either. And it doesn't look like a boom. Sorry. Which is exactly why people are confused. They're confused because we've trained all of ourselves to recognize extremes. Crash. Or expansion. But what happens after shock? Those shock cycles end. Is something quieter? Maybe. It's not collapse. It's not euphoria. It's sorting. And sorting phases quietly determine who builds leverage, and who loses it, unfortunately. That's where we are now. Yeah. What a sorting phase is. Let's talk about that. A sorting phase begins when cheap capital disappears. Risk becomes expensive. Speculation cools. Efficiency matters. Efficiency matters again. You see, for over a decade, money was quote-unquote cheap. If you borrow aggressively, you won. If you bought assets, they appreciated. If you expanded quickly, well, momentum probably carried you. And that environment trained our behavior, whether or not we knew it. I think it really kind of rewarded speed. It rewarded optimism. It definitely rewarded leverage. But higher cost capital changes incentives. So, now, mistakes cost more. Overpaying costs more. Weak skill sets cost more. Emotional decisions most certainly cost more. So, sorting phases are not dramatic. They're selective. Believe me, they're selective. And selective exposes positioning. Yeah. So let's talk about housing in a quote-unquote sorting phase. We've already established housing isn't 2008. Inventory is tight. Owners, they're rate locked. And demographics are, let's call them stretched. That hasn't changed. What's changed is behavior. You see, because in a sorting phase, overpriced listings, they'll sit. Serious buyers, they negotiate. Investors, they're going to prioritize cash flow, appreciation. Now look at your local markets. The Verge. National headlines become blunt instruments. Sorry, my voice. Local knowledge, it becomes leverage. This is where discipline returns to pricing, not panic. Definitely not a collapse. Discipline. And discipline separates outcomes. Let's talk about labor, AI, and skill compression. Now let's talk about the labor. The labor market isn't imploding. It's compression, like we've been talking about. In cheap money eras, average performance survived. In higher cost eras, average performance gets squeezed. AI is not eliminating everyone, no. It is, however, eliminating repetitive value. If your work can be automated, it will be possibly replaced. If your work requires judgment, synthesis, relationship building, local expertise, you gain leverage. This is uncomfortable, I know, but it is structural. What we're doing is sorting phases and reward adaptability. You see, they punish dependency on what? Momentum. Let's talk about media. Media distortion. How about that? Like I said, crank up the volume. I know I have. Now here's why it feels heavier than it actually is. We consume instability constantly. Every headline is urgent. Every tweet is dramatic. Every slowdown is framed as crisis. You see, because crisis sells. Calm, however, recalibration does not. But sorting phases are nuanced. They are gradual. They don't trend. they don't usually go viral. So people will interpret slow change as instability, when in reality, it's called repositioning. That psychological gap matters, most certainly, because fear distorts timing, and timing, well, it determines leverage. So, how about culture? Let's talk about that cultural layer. You see, because there's also a cultural overlay. We've normalized urgency, constant news, constant comparison, constant reaction. But urgency is not strategy, if that makes sense. Sorting phases reward restraint. They reward patience. They reward clarity. And clarity feels, but boring. But boring builds wealth most often. Boring builds stability. Boring, it builds power. Selective eras reward adults. So, what about this personal insert that I like to give you? Let me make this personal. When rates shifted and momentum slowed, I had a choice. React emotionally or reposition structurally. I chose to reposition. That meant paying attention to local data, over the national news, noise, whatever you want to call it, and becoming more disciplined in pricing and definitely in conversations. Focusing more on education instead of that crazy urgency. Expanding multiple content channels, maybe, instead of just relying on one stream. Maybe strengthening relationships instead of chasing transactions. So no, it wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. You see, I didn't need a crash to adjust. I needed clarity. That's kind of the difference between reacting and positioning. So let's talk about prediction. Here's the part that people aren't saying. Well, at least they're not saying it clearly. the next 2 to 3 years will not reward hype. No. They will, however, reward discipline. And I believe that growth will fragment. Some regions will outperform. And some industries, they'll compress for sure. Now, some individuals will definitely accelerate. And I'm sorry to say, others will stall. And it will not be evenly distributed. No. But still, this is not a collapse. It is a selection. And selection transfers leverage. And what it's doing is quietly. Yeah. Now, how to position yourself. So what do adults do, when you're sorting through this phase? Build liquidity. Cash creates optionality. Upgrade skill stacks. Compete on judgment, not repetition. Know your local market deeply. You're going to have to ignore national emotional swings. Try to reduce unnecessarily with the leverage. Higher cost capital punishes overextension. So, limit narrative consumption. Calm thinking is real leverage. Maybe try to prioritize like your cash flow over appreciation fantasy. Strengthen networks. Opportunity flows through what? Relationships? Especially during a compression. I actually believe always. But sorting phases reward preparation. And guess what? They punish impulse, which is nothing new. So, I'm not going to take too much more of your time, but in closing, sorting phases don't announce themselves. They don't trend. They quietly shift. They shift that leverage. Most people recognize what's happening until the repositioning. Until that repositioning is complete. I'm going to keep tracking this. I'm not going to throw in panic though. I'm not going to throw in hype. I'm gonna though, however, throw in structure. Because the next few years aren't reacting. They're about positioning. And the people who understand the structure, hopefully earlier than later, don't have to scramble later. So, if you want clarity as this unfolds, stay close. In the next video, I'm going to break down where opportunity quietly builds inside this phase